Sometimes the strongest people are the ones no one bothers to notice until it's far too late. The morning sun stretched across the quiet streets of Ashford, Georgia, painting warm light over brick storefronts and freshly washed sidewalks as neighbors drifted from one small business to another, exchanging friendly waves and familiar smiles. On the corner of Maple Avenue stood Bennett's General Store, a modest family-owned shop where the coffee was always hot, the shelves were neatly stocked, and the owner somehow remembered every customer's name. Marcus Bennett unlocked the front door at exactly 7:30 a.m., just as he had nearly every day for the past 8 years. He greeted the delivery driver with an easy smile, helped an elderly customer carry a 40-pound bag of garden soil to her pickup, and paused long enough to hand a young boy the bicycle pump he had repaired free of charge the evening before. Nothing about Marcus invited attention. He dressed simply in worn blue jeans, sturdy work boots, and a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. His voice never rose above a calm conversation, and his movements carried the quiet confidence of someone who had learned long ago that composure often spoke louder than words. To most people passing by, he was simply another hard-working black shop owner trying to earn an honest living in a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Yet there was something difficult to explain about him. Every task seemed measured. Every glance was deliberate. Even the way he arranged canned goods on the shelves looked almost methodical, as though years of discipline still shaped habits no ordinary customer could recognize. Behind the checkout counter rested an old framed photograph turned face down, its image hidden from view. Beside it sat a weathered wristwatch with deep scratches across its metal case, one Marcus never wore but never put away. Shortly after 9 o'clock, a black SUV rolled slowly past the store before continuing around the block. A few minutes later it returned, this time followed by another patrol vehicle. Several customers noticed, but quickly returned to their shopping. Marcus looked briefly through the front window, then quietly resumed helping a young mother compare prices on school supplies. He showed no sign of concern, no visible frustration, and certainly no fear. Outside, the patrol vehicles eased to the curb. Four white officers stepped onto the sidewalk with determined expressions, scanning the storefront before exchanging brief nods with one another. Curious conversations faded as nearby pedestrians slowed their pace. A man walking his dog stopped across the street. A waitress from the diner next door stepped outside, holding a tray she suddenly forgot to deliver. The ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood seemed to pause without anyone understanding why. The officers entered together, their polished boots echoing softly across the wooden floor as every head instinctively turned toward the front entrance. Marcus slowly looked up from the register, meeting their eyes with the same calm expression he had shown every customer that morning. For several long seconds, neither side spoke. The silence settled over the little store with surprising weight, leaving everyone present wondering why a peaceful neighborhood business had suddenly become the center of so much attention. While Marcus Bennett stood perfectly still, as though he had seen moments like this before and already understood that the next few minutes would change far more than anyone inside that store could possibly imagine. The tallest officer stepped forward and rested one hand lightly against the front counter, not with friendliness, but with the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His name tag read Daniel Brooks. His eyes drifted across the neatly arranged shelves before settling on Marcus. "Morning," he said evenly. "We are conducting a routine inspection." The words sounded ordinary enough, yet something in his tone caused every customer in the store to fall silent. Marcus nodded politely. "Good morning, officers. Let me know how I can help." There was no hesitation in his voice, no trace of irritation. He simply stepped away from the register, giving them room to move. Brooks glanced toward another officer, who immediately began examining display cases while a third slowly walked down each aisle, opening cabinet doors and checking storage areas. Nothing appeared unusual inside the small business. Every permit hung neatly on the wall. Every receipt sat organized inside labeled folders. Every shelf was clean and fully stocked. Even so, the officers continued searching with growing determination, as though they expected something to reveal itself if they looked long enough. A customer quietly asked whether everything was all right. Marcus answered with the same calm smile he offered everyone. "I am sure everything will work itself out." The woman nodded uncertainly before stepping aside. Across the room, a young cashier named Emily watched nervously as one officer inspected inventory records that had already been made available without objection. She looked toward Marcus, expecting frustration or anger, but found neither. Instead, he calmly straightened a display of canned soup that had been shifted out of place during the inspection. The action seemed strangely out of place, almost as though preserving order mattered more to him than defending himself. Outside, more neighbors gathered along the sidewalk. Nobody shouted. Nobody interfered. They simply watched through the large front windows, sensing that something about the scene did not feel right. Inside, Brooks noticed the old wristwatch resting behind the register. He picked it up briefly before placing it back exactly where he had found it. "Interesting piece," he remarked. Marcus looked at it for only a second. "It reminds me where I have been." Brooks waited for further explanation, but none came. The answer seemed complete, leaving an awkward silence between them. A moment later, another officer discovered the face-down photograph and instinctively reached toward it. Marcus spoke for the first time with quiet firmness. "Please handle that carefully." The request carried no threat and no anger, only unexpected weight. The officer paused before slowly returning the frame to the counter without turning it over. Brooks noticed the exchange. He also noticed something else that had escaped everyone around him. Marcus never raised his voice. He never argued. He never asked why they had come. He simply observed every movement with remarkable patience, as though he had learned long ago that people often revealed far more about themselves than they intended. Then a faint vibration broke the silence. A cell phone resting beneath the counter illuminated the polished wood. The screen displayed an incoming call from an unfamiliar Washington, District of Columbia number. Marcus glanced at the name, allowed the phone to ring twice, then quietly pressed decline without a word. None of the customers recognized the significance of the call. Most of the officers ignored it completely. But Brooks caught the area code, watched Marcus return the phone to his pocket without explanation, and for the first time since entering the store, a small shadow of uncertainty crossed his expression. Officer Daniel Brooks folded his arms as he studied Marcus with growing curiosity. Most people became defensive when surrounded by law enforcement inside their own business. Some protested loudly. Others rushed to explain themselves before anyone asked a single question. Marcus did neither. He simply stood beside the register with relaxed shoulders and steady eyes, answering every question directly, never volunteering more than necessary, and never allowing emotion to guide his words. It was the kind of composure that unsettled people who expected fear. Emily quietly continued organizing receipts behind the counter, although her hands moved slower than before. She had worked for Marcus for nearly 3 years and had never once heard him raise his voice at a customer, a supplier, or even a difficult delivery driver. When a shipment arrived damaged, he thanked the driver anyway. When someone could not afford groceries, he often found a quiet way to help without embarrassing them. The neighborhood knew him as a dependable businessman whose reputation had been earned one ordinary day at a time. Brooks glanced toward the business license hanging on the wall. Everything was current. Health inspection certificates were displayed exactly where required. Tax documentation matched the records the officers had already reviewed. Every answer seemed to remove another reason for suspicion, yet the inspection continued. Outside, the small crowd along Maple Avenue continued to grow. People exchanged uncertain looks, but remained respectful, sensing that whatever was unfolding inside Bennett's General Store deserved patience rather than speculation. An elderly man named Harold Simmons slowly stepped through the front door, carrying a wooden cane polished smooth by years of use. He had been shopping at the store since Marcus first opened the business. Looking around at the officers, Harold smiled politely before turning toward Marcus. "I came to pick up my usual coffee," he said. Marcus returned the smile without missing a beat. "It is already waiting for you, Mr. Simmons." Emily quietly reached beneath the counter and handed the older man his familiar package. Harold paused, studying the tense atmosphere before speaking softly. "You always remember everyone." Marcus simply answered, "People remember how you make them feel." Brooks heard the exchange, but said nothing. There was no performance in Marcus's kindness. It appeared completely natural, almost routine. One of the younger officers wandered toward a hallway leading to the storage room. Mounted high on the wall was a faded photograph of several volunteers rebuilding homes after a hurricane. Marcus stood near the edge of the picture wearing work gloves and a baseball cap, blending into the group without drawing attention. Another frame displayed local youth baseball teams Marcus had sponsored over the years. None of the photographs suggested wealth, influence, or prestige. They reflected only quiet service. Even so, Brooks found himself wondering why someone with such disciplined habits carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent years making difficult decisions under pressure. The answer remained hidden, concealed beneath an ordinary life that seemed almost intentionally unremarkable. As the questions continued, another phone resting in Marcus's pocket vibrated once before falling silent. This time he did not even look at the screen. Instead, he calmly reached for a carton of milk left on the counter by a distracted customer and returned it to the refrigerator before it could spoil. That simple gesture caught Brooks completely off guard. In the middle of an uncomfortable inspection, while neighbors watched through the windows and officers searched every corner of his livelihood, Marcus's first concern was still taking care of someone else's groceries. Brooks could not explain why, but for the first time that morning he began to suspect they were standing inside the story of a man they did not truly know. The quiet tension inside the store grew heavier with every passing minute. Officer Daniel Brooks slowly walked another lap through the aisles, saying very little, but his eyes missed almost nothing. Every label was perfectly aligned. Every inventory sheet matched the products on the shelves. Every answer Marcus gave remained calm, respectful, and complete. Instead of bringing clarity, that unusual level of order seemed to deepen Brooks's suspicion. He had expected inconsistencies, nervous explanations, or signs that someone was trying to hide something. Instead, he found a business that appeared to be operating exactly as it should. One of the younger officers approached carrying a small metal cash box that had been sitting beneath the counter. "Should we open this?" he asked. Marcus answered before anyone else spoke. "It contains the weekly deposit receipts. You are welcome to look if that is part of your procedure." Brooks gave a brief nod. The box was opened carefully. Inside were neatly organized envelopes, bank records, and handwritten notes tracking donations collected for the local food pantry. Emily quietly explained that every Friday the store donated groceries to several elderly residents who struggled to make ends meet. No one responded. The officers simply continued their work. Outside, another patrol vehicle arrived, drawing even more attention from passing drivers. Several people stopped across the street, whispering quietly among themselves. A local newspaper photographer happened to drive by, slowed for a moment, then continued without stopping, uncertain whether anything newsworthy was actually happening. Inside the store, the atmosphere remained strangely restrained. There were no raised voices, no arguments, and no dramatic confrontation. Yet everyone could feel an invisible pressure building with every unanswered question. Brooks finally stepped directly in front of Marcus. "You seem unusually comfortable," he observed. Marcus met his eyes without hesitation. Being respectful costs nothing. Brooks studied him for another long moment. "Most people become nervous during an inspection." Marcus answered with the same steady tone. "Most people cannot control what others decide to do. They can only control how they respond." The simple statement lingered in the room. Even Emily stopped sorting paperwork to listen. Brooks did not reply immediately. Instead, he glanced once more toward the old wristwatch resting behind the register. Something about it continued to bother him, though he could not explain why. The younger officer who had searched the storage room returned carrying a dusty cardboard box discovered on the highest shelf. "Found this in the back," he announced. Marcus nodded calmly. "Old records from when I first opened the store." The box was placed on the counter and opened. Inside were faded invoices, business licenses, community event flyers, and photographs from neighborhood fundraisers stretching back years. There was nothing remarkable until a single folded envelope slipped onto the floor. Before anyone could reach it, Marcus quietly bent down and picked it up. He looked at the sealed envelope for only a second before placing it back inside the box without opening it. Brooks noticed the care with which Marcus handled it. "Important memory?" he asked. Marcus offered the faintest smile. "Some chapters of life are worth remembering. Others are worth leaving closed until the right day." No one fully understood what he meant, but his words settled over the room with unexpected weight. At that exact moment, the silence outside was broken by the distant sound of several powerful engines approaching from somewhere beyond Maple Avenue. The sound was still far away, barely noticeable to most people, but Marcus heard it immediately. His expression did not change. He simply lifted his eyes toward the front window for the briefest moment before calmly returning his attention to the officers standing in front of him. The distant engines grew louder until nearly everyone inside the store noticed them, yet no one could tell where they were coming from or why they seemed to be drawing closer to Maple Avenue. Officer Daniel Brooks briefly glanced toward the front windows before returning his attention to Marcus. "Expecting someone?" he asked. Marcus answered with complete honesty. "Not that I know of." There was no uncertainty in his voice, only quiet patience. The answer somehow felt genuine, and that only made Brooks more uneasy. A younger officer continued sorting through the old documents stacked inside the cardboard box. Most contained nothing more than faded receipts, supplier contracts, and community event flyers. Then he found a small leather notebook tucked beneath a bundle of invoices. It showed years of wear, its edges softened with age. "What is this?" he asked. Marcus looked at it and smiled faintly. "A journal from another chapter of my life. Mind if we take a look?" Brooks asked. Marcus gave a polite nod. "You are welcome to." The notebook opened to pages filled with careful handwriting. There were no names of operations, no classified information, nothing dramatic. Instead, each page contained short reflections about discipline, responsibility, teamwork, and the importance of protecting people who depended on you. One sentence near the center of a page caught Brooks's attention. It read, "Leadership begins the moment nobody is watching." Another page simply read, "Stay calm. Others will borrow your courage before they borrow your words." Brooks closed the notebook slowly. They sounded less like motivational quotes and more like lessons someone had carried for decades. Before he could ask another question, Harold Simmons quietly cleared his throat near the checkout counter. "You know," the elderly man said, leaning gently on his cane, "Marcus has always been like that." Brooks looked toward him. Harold continued, "About 4 years ago, a tornado knocked out power across half the county. Before the emergency crews even arrived, Marcus had already organized food, water, flashlights, and volunteers. Nobody asked him to. He simply started helping." Another customer nodded in agreement. A woman added, "During the winter freeze, he opened this store before sunrise every day just so families could stay warm for a while." Emily smiled softly. "He never tells people those stories himself." Marcus lowered his eyes slightly, clearly uncomfortable being praised. "There were plenty of people helping," he replied. Harold chuckled. "Maybe so, but everybody looked to you first." Brooks listened without interrupting. The picture forming in his mind refused to match the assumptions that had brought him there. Across the room, one officer noticed a pair of old hiking boots resting neatly on the top shelf in the storage area. They appeared ordinary except for the soles, which showed unusual patterns of long distance where unlike anything expected from someone who spent every day running a neighborhood store. Nearby hung an old backpack that looked carefully maintained despite its age. None of these items proved anything. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they suggested a past far different from the quiet life Marcus now lived. Then the phone in Marcus's pocket vibrated once again. This time the screen briefly illuminated before locking itself. Brooks happened to catch only 2 words before the display disappeared: Fort Liberty. Marcus calmly silenced the phone without reading the message. He slipped it back into his pocket exactly as another low rumble echoed through the street outside, noticeably closer now, causing several people standing along the sidewalk to turn their heads toward the approaching sound, while Marcus remained as composed as ever, almost as though he had learned long ago that patience often reveals the truth long before explanations ever can. The sound outside finally reached the front of the store. One by one, conversations along Maple Avenue faded into complete silence as 3 dark government vehicles rolled to a smooth stop beside the patrol cars already parked outside. None of them carried flashing lights. None of them made dramatic entrances. They simply arrived with quiet precision, drawing every eye on the street. Inside the store, Officer Daniel Brooks instinctively turned toward the front window. The younger officers exchanged uncertain looks, their confidence giving way to curiosity. Emily quietly stepped away from the register. Harold Simmons adjusted his glasses and stared toward the sidewalk. Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing, his expression calm and unreadable. A few seconds later, the front door opened. A man in a neatly pressed Army service uniform entered with measured steps, followed by two additional uniformed personnel. Their appearance immediately changed the atmosphere inside the building. They were composed, professional, and carried themselves with the unmistakable discipline of career military leaders. The senior officer paused just inside the entrance, scanned the room once, and his eyes settled on Marcus. Without hesitation, he walked forward. Every movement inside the store seemed to stop. Brooks watched carefully, unsure what he was about to witness. The senior officer came to a complete stop only a few feet from Marcus. Then, with quiet dignity, he offered a respectful salute. "Good morning, Commander Bennett," he said clearly. "I apologize for arriving later than expected." The words landed over the room like complete silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Emily's eyes widened. Harold slowly lowered his cane, his expression filled with astonishment. Even the customers standing near the aisle seemed unable to process what they had just heard. Brooks blinked once, convinced he had misunderstood. "Commander," he repeated almost under his breath. Marcus returned the salute with calm professionalism before extending his hand instead. "Good morning, Colonel Hayes. There is no need for apologies." The colonel accepted the handshake warmly. "Washington informed us you declined several calls this morning. When we could not reach you, we decided it would be better to come in person." Marcus offered a faint smile. "I was occupied." Colonel Hayes glanced briefly around the store, taking in the open record boxes, the gathered officers, and the anxious faces of the customers. He asked no immediate questions. Instead, he looked back toward Marcus with unmistakable respect. "Sir, your retirement file may say you own a neighborhood store, but around Fort Liberty your name still carries extraordinary respect. The Leadership Academy continues teaching decisions you made overseas because they saved lives and brought people home safely." The room remained frozen. Brooks felt his heartbeat quicken as countless small details from the morning suddenly connected in his mind. The discipline, the notebook, the worn boots, the quiet confidence, the unanswered calls from Washington. None of it had been coincidence. Marcus had never hinted at who he once was because he had never needed to. His identity had never depended on recognition. Colonel Hayes reached into a leather portfolio and carefully removed a framed certificate bearing the seal of the Department of the Army. "Commander Bennett," he said, "we were actually on our way to invite you to next month's leadership symposium. Several active Delta Force officers specifically requested that you speak." A quiet gasp spread through the store. Officer Daniel Brooks slowly lowered his eyes, realizing that the man he had spent the entire morning trying to figure out had never been hiding his character at all. He had simply been living it. No one inside Bennett's general store spoke for several long seconds. The silence carried far more weight than any explanation ever could. Officer Daniel Brooks slowly looked from Colonel Hayes back to Marcus Bennett, searching for some sign that this extraordinary moment was a misunderstanding. There was none. Marcus stood exactly as he had throughout the entire morning, calm, humble, and composed. Nothing about him had changed. The only difference was that everyone else was finally beginning to see the man who had been standing in front of them all along. Colonel Hayes turned toward Brooks with quiet professionalism. "Officer," he said, "Commander Bennett dedicated decades of his life to serving this country with distinction. Even after retiring from active military service, he has continued serving his community every single day. We appreciate your commitment to public safety, but I believe it is clear you have found nothing here that suggests otherwise." Brooks glanced around the spotless store, the organized records, the donation receipts, the community photographs, and the familiar faces of neighbors who had trusted Marcus for years. Every assumption he had made earlier that morning now seemed painfully incomplete. He slowly nodded. "Yes, Colonel. We found no violations." His voice sounded quieter than before. One by one, the other officers carefully returned every document to its proper place. The leather notebook was placed back inside the storage box with unexpected care. The old wristwatch remained exactly where Marcus had left it. Emily watched silently as the shelves were straightened and the business records were neatly stacked again. Nobody instructed the officers to do so. They simply did it. Harold Simmons smiled gently as he observed the scene. "Funny thing about respect," the elderly man said softly. "Sometimes people spend hours looking for proof of character when they could have seen it in the first 5 minutes." His words settled naturally into the room. No one argued with him. Colonel Hayes accepted the framed certificate from one of the soldiers accompanying him before offering it to Marcus. Commander Bennett, this recognition honors your years of leadership, your commitment to those who served beside you, and your continued service to your community. The uniform may no longer be part of your daily life, but your example certainly is. Marcus accepted the frame with both hands and offered a grateful smile. Thank you, Colonel. I have always believed that service does not end when someone leaves the military. It simply changes shape. Several customers quietly applauded. The sound spread naturally until nearly everyone inside the store joined in. It was not applause for medals or titles. It was recognition of a man whose actions had spoken long before anyone learned about his remarkable past. Brooks stepped forward after the applause faded. For a brief moment, he seemed unsure of what to say. Finally, he looked Marcus directly in the eyes. Mr. Bennett, he said sincerely, I appreciate the patience and respect you showed us today. Marcus nodded warmly. Respect is easiest to give when you remember that every person has a story you have not heard yet. Brooks lowered his head slightly, allowing those words to sink in. They were not spoken as criticism or triumph. They sounded more like a lesson offered without judgment. Outside, the small crowd gradually dispersed as neighbors returned to their daily routines. Inside the store, the ordinary rhythm of business slowly returned as Emily greeted customers. Harold collected his coffee, and Marcus carefully placed the framed certificate beside the old photograph that had remained face down all morning. For the first time that day, he gently turned the photograph upright, revealing a younger Marcus standing shoulder to shoulder with members of his Delta Force team, all smiling not because of what they had accomplished, but because every one of them had made it home together. The afternoon sunlight poured through the front windows once again, washing the wooden floor in warm golden light, as though the little store had quietly returned to being what it had always been, a place where neighbors greeted one another by name and ordinary kindness mattered more than titles. The military vehicles had departed with the same quiet professionalism they had arrived with, leaving behind nothing but thoughtful silence and a conversation the town would remember for years. Officer Daniel Brooks remained near the entrance for another moment before slowly approaching Marcus one final time. There was no audience left to impress and no authority left to demonstrate. His voice carried a sincerity that had been absent earlier that morning. Commander Bennett, he began before pausing, then gently corrected himself. Marcus, if you will allow me, I think I learned something important today. Marcus smiled warmly. The best lessons usually arrive when we are not expecting them. Brooks nodded. I spent hours trying to figure out who you were. The truth was right in front of me the entire time. Marcus glanced around the store where Emily was helping a young family find school supplies, while Harold Simmons laughed with another regular customer near the coffee display. People often look for extraordinary stories, Marcus replied softly. Most of the time, character reveals itself through ordinary moments. Brooks followed his gaze and finally understood what Marcus meant. None of the neighbors respected him because of medals they had never seen or missions they had never heard about. They respected him because he treated every customer with patience, remembered birthdays, carried groceries to waiting cars, sponsored youth baseball teams, donated food without seeking recognition, and quietly solved problems before anyone realized they existed. His military service explained his discipline, but it did not define his worth. The values he had practiced in uniform had simply followed him into civilian life. Emily carefully placed the framed certificate beside the team photograph, now resting upright behind the counter. Looking at the two frames together, she smiled. You could have displayed these years ago, she said. Marcus gently shook his head. The people who needed to know already knew. Everyone else deserved to judge me by how I treated them today, not by something I accomplished years ago. Harold chuckled from across the room. That sounds exactly like something you would say. Laughter spread naturally through the store, replacing every trace of tension that had filled the building only an hour earlier. Brooks quietly removed a small notepad from his pocket. Instead of writing a report, he wrote down a single sentence he hoped he would never forget. Every person has a story you have not heard yet. He folded the page carefully and placed it inside his wallet. Marcus noticed, but said nothing. Some lessons did not require another conversation. Outside, the sidewalks filled once more with families, delivery trucks, students, and shoppers moving through another ordinary afternoon in Ashford. Bennett's General Store looked exactly as it had before sunrise, modest, welcoming, and unremarkable to anyone driving past. Yet for everyone who had stood inside that building that day, nothing about it would ever seem ordinary again. They had walked in expecting to witness an investigation. They walked out having witnessed humility, dignity, quiet leadership, and the reminder that true strength rarely announces itself before it is needed. Marcus returned to the register, greeted the next customer with the same calm smile he had worn since opening the doors that morning, and continued serving his community exactly as he always had, proving once again that the greatest leaders are often the ones who never feel the need to tell the world who they are. The following Monday morning arrived with the same gentle rhythm that had always defined Bennett's General Store. The coffee brewed before sunrise, the front door opened at exactly 7:30, and familiar customers wandered inside with warm greetings that felt more like family than routine business. Nothing about the building suggested that only days earlier it had become the center of an unforgettable lesson. Marcus Bennett greeted each visitor exactly as he always had, never mentioning the military delegation, never displaying the certificate more prominently than the family photographs beside it, and never speaking about the events that had drawn so much attention. Life simply moved forward. Officer Daniel Brooks parked across the street just before noon, this time alone and out of uniform. He carried no notebook, no official paperwork, and no expectation beyond a quiet conversation. When he entered the store, Marcus looked up with the same welcoming smile he offered everyone else. "Good afternoon," Marcus said. "What can I help you find today?" Brooks smiled back. "Actually, I came to buy some coffee." Marcus handed him the same locally roasted blend Harold Simmons always purchased. Brooks laughed softly. "You remembered." Marcus shrugged. People appreciate being remembered. They spoke for several minutes about ordinary things, the weather, local baseball, and the upcoming community food drive. Not once did Marcus remind Brooks of the uncomfortable inspection or the misunderstanding that had brought them together. That choice stayed with Brooks far longer than any lecture could have. As he prepared to leave, he paused beside the front door. "Marcus," he said quietly, "thank you for showing me more grace than I probably deserved." Marcus answered with the calm wisdom that had shaped every part of his life. Grace is not earned by perfect moments. It is offered because tomorrow gives all of us another chance to become better than we were yesterday. Brooks nodded thoughtfully before walking back into the afternoon sunlight, carrying far more than a bag of coffee. Weeks later, the annual town appreciation picnic filled the local park with families, music, and laughter. Volunteers served meals, children played under bright blue skies, and neighbors gathered beneath rows of oak trees. Marcus worked quietly behind one of the food tables, making sure everyone had enough to eat before filling his own plate. When the mayor stepped onto the small stage to recognize community volunteers, Marcus's name was announced alongside teachers, firefighters, nurses, and countless ordinary citizens whose kindness strengthened the town every day. The applause that followed came not because he had once led elite soldiers or earned extraordinary honors. It came because the people of Ashford knew him as the man who carried groceries, repaired bicycles, remembered birthdays, supported local charities, and treated every person with dignity. Those accomplishments meant the most to him. As the evening sun settled beyond the trees, Marcus locked the store one final time for the day and paused outside for a quiet moment. He looked across Maple Avenue where neighbors waved as they headed home, then smiled before turning off the lights inside. The town had discovered something remarkable about him, yet the greatest truth had never been hidden at all. His character had always been visible to anyone willing to look beyond assumptions. Because a uniform may earn respect for a season, but integrity earns trust for a lifetime. And the strongest leaders are rarely the loudest people in the room. They are the ones who quietly lift others, choose dignity over pride, and leave every place better than they found it.